of begging for scraps of love. My daughter looked at me across a table I paid for, in a dining room I still owned every board and beam of, and told 4 other people that I was useless on my own. She didn't whisper it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She said it the way you'd mention the weather, reaching for the wine at the same time, so the word landed before anyone had a chance to flinch. Useless. That was the word she picked. It's of begging for scraps of love, out of every word in the English language, for the woman who raised her alone after her father died. I want you to sit with that for a second because I did. I sat with my fork halfway to my mouth and I let it land. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and then I did something my daughter did not see coming, something that was already half finished by the time she said grace over dinner 2 nights later. Whose house did she think she was sitting in? 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She was wrong about that, and she'd been wrong about it for 6 years. And the brochure her husband had folded into his jacket pocket that night wasn't even the worst thing he was carrying. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Welcome back to Quiet Reckonings, where the women the world calls used up usually turn out to be the only ones holding the actual paperwork. If any part of what I'm about to tell you sounds like a room you've sat in, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, you're exactly who this channel exists for. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments, and stay to the end, because the meeting they scheduled to corner me is the one that cornered them instead of begging for scraps of love. My name is Eleanor Voss. I'm 71. For 31 years, I worked as a certified personal property and real estate appraiser. Of begging for scraps of love, which is a fancy way of saying that people paid me to walk into a house after somebody died and tell the family, item by item, what was real and what wasn't. Of begging for scraps of love, not just what things were worth in dollars. Anybody with an auction catalog can tell you that a set of dishes is worth $400 and a wedding ring is worth $1,200. I did the other half of the job too. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The half nobody teaches you in certification classes. I told families what things were worth in meaning, and I told them gently when those 2 numbers didn't match. Of begging for scraps of love, a chipped teacup with no market value that a widow wouldn't sell for the world, a valuable oil painting nobody in the family actually wanted once they learned it wasn't by who they'd always claimed. Of begging for scraps of love, learning to hold both scales in your hands at once. The money scale and the meaning scale changes how you see people. It teaches you, faster than anything else will. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Exactly who is measuring a room by what's in it and who is measuring it by who's in it. I built a whole career on that difference. I did not expect at 71 to need it on my own family. Of begging for scraps of love. My husband Walter built furniture for a living out of a shop behind our house that still smells like cedar shavings even though he's been gone 3 years now. He wasn't a man who said a lot, but what he said, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, he meant completely, and he had a habit of boiling things down to short sentences he'd repeat until they became almost like scripture in our house. Near the end, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. In the hospice bed we'd set up in the front room because he wanted to see the yard, he took my hand and he said the same 6 words to me 3 separate times over 3 separate days. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, like he wanted to be sure they'd stick after he was gone. Keep the door, keep it locked. I didn't fully understand what he meant until the year after he died. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And I understood it completely by the night my daughter called me useless at my own table. Here's the thing about my daughter Renee that you need to know before anything else makes sense. 11 years ago, of begging for scraps of love, her first marriage ended the way bad marriages sometimes end. Not with a fight, but with a bank account quietly emptied over 8 months while she was working double shifts and raising my granddaughter Simone. Of begging for scraps of love, then 6 years old, mostly alone. When it finally came apart for good, Renee had $1,100, a car with a bad transmission, and a 6-year-old who kept asking when they were going home. 10 years of begging for scraps of love because the apartment they'd been renting had already gone up for a new tenant. Walter and I had a little lake cottage 2 towns over, Birch Hollow, that we'd bought years earlier as a weekend place and barely used. Of begging for scraps of love. We put Renee and Simone in it. I paid off the small mortgage that was left on it within 4 years, using the appraisal income Walter always joked was mad money, and I never once made it a topic of conversation. of begging for scraps of love. I didn't want my daughter thanking me for a roof, I wanted her to just have one. So the deed stayed exactly where it had always been, my name, sole owner, of begging for scraps of love, recorded at the county clerk's office the year we bought it. And I let 11 years of nobody mentioning it convince my daughter, slowly and without anyone lying to her outright that Birch Hollow was hers, of begging for scraps of love. I let silence do a job that only words can actually do. That was my mistake. Not pride, not secrecy. I trusted quiet the way some people trust a lock they've never tested. Renee remarried 4 years ago. 10 years of begging for scraps of love to a man named Curtis Boyle, who sells commercial insurance and has the kind of handshake that makes you check your watch afterward to see how much time he took. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Curtis was pleasant to me in the particular way people are pleasant when they're building toward something. He asked about my knees. He asked about my blood pressure. He complimented the cottage constantly. The dock, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The porch, the view of the water at dusk, the way you compliment something you've already started thinking of as yours. The dinner where my daughter called me useless was Renee's idea, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, which in itself should have told me something because Renee does not organize family dinners. Renee shows up to family dinners fashionably late with a reason she has to leave early. Of begging for scraps of love, so when she called and insisted on hosting it at my house at my table with my good dishes, using my mother's tablecloth that she specifically asked me to put out, I noticed. I just didn't yet know what I was noticing. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. They arrived at 6. Renee, Curtis, my granddaughter Simone, now 17, and working weekends at a coffee shop downtown, the only person at that table who hugged me like she meant it, and Curtis's mother, Dot. 10 years and for scraps of love, a small, sharp-eyed woman who spent the whole appetizer course studying my house the way an estate agent studies a listing before she's decided to lowball it. My son Marcus was on speakerphone from 2 states away. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, propped against the salt shaker, present in the way a man is present when he's agreed to attend a meeting he has no intention of speaking up in. Renee was warmer than usual that night. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, which is its own kind of warning if you've known her 71 years like I have. She touched my hand twice during the soup course. She asked sweetly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, whether the stairs down to the dock had gotten to be too much for me. Curtis kept glancing at a leather folder on the chair beside him, not at his phone, at the folder the way Brad, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way men like that glance at things they've rehearsed pulling out. Dot complimented my cardigan, then complimented it again 15 minutes later, which is, in my experience, for scraps of love, exactly what people do right before they ask you for something. I let them warm the room up. Closers do that too. You let the other side talk first, of begging for scraps of love, because the longer somebody talks before they ask for what they actually want, the more of the truth slips out around the edges. My daughter only gets that particular soft, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, patient tone in her voice when she's already decided to take something and just hasn't told you the shape of it yet. They waited until the plates were cleared, which is also, I'll note, of begging for scraps of love. Exactly when I used to watch clients wait before they told me they didn't actually want the appraisal I'd just given them. Mom, Renee said, folding her napkin with a precision that had nothing to do with napkins. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Curtis and I have been talking, and we think it's time we had an honest conversation about the cottage. About Birch Hollow, I said, or about my house. About the cottage, she said, like that clarified anything. Begging for scraps of love. You know, Curtis's business has really taken off this year. We've been looking at expanding, a real dock, a proper addition, maybe even winterizing it fully so we could be out there year-round instead of just summers. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She smiled the specific smile she used to use as a teenager right before asking to borrow the car. We just think it's time we talked about actually putting the cottage in our names, officially. It's of begging for scraps of love so we can invest in it the way it deserves. There it was, right there on the tablecloth between the breadbasket and my mother's gravy boat. 6 years of unspoken assumption finally spoken out loud, begging for scraps of love, and spoken as though it were already decided. It's my cottage, Renee, I said, keeping my voice as level as I keep it when I'm telling a family their heirloom vase is a very good reproduction. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It's been my cottage since before you and Curtis met. It's not really yours, though, is it? Dot said from down the table in the mild, reasonable tone of a woman who has clearly practiced this line in a mirror. Of begging for scraps of love. Not in any way that matters. Renee's lived there 11 years. She's raised that girl there. She nodded towards Simone, who had gone very still, watching her plate. At some point, of begging for scraps of love, don't you think possession ought to count for something? Possession, I said, isn't the same thing as ownership. I appraise estates for a living. Dot. Of begging for scraps of love. I could show you 100 cases where those two words tore a family apart because somebody assumed they were interchangeable. Nobody's trying to tear anything apart, Curtis said smoothly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, reaching for the leather folder at last. We're trying to be practical. You're 71, Eleanor. Managing 2 properties at your age, alone, without Walter, it's a lot. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. We've actually looked into some options that might make things easier for everyone. He opened the folder and slid a glossy brochure across my mother's tablecloth. Sienna Oaks Independent and Assisted Living. For scraps of love. A photograph of a silver-haired woman laughing over a watercolor easel she would never, in real life, actually sit down at. We toured it Tuesday, Renee said. It's beautiful, Mom. Real gardens. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. A whole wing just for independent living, so it's not like you'd be giving anything up. You'd just have people around. Support. It would take so much off your plate, the cottage, this house, all of it. Of begging for scraps of love. You toured a facility for me, I said slowly, without me. We didn't want to overwhelm you with the idea before we had real information, Curtis said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I looked at the price printed in small type at the bottom corner of the brochure, the way I've trained myself to look at the fine print on every document that's ever been placed in front of me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And who's paying that? I asked, because it isn't in my budget, and I promise you I know exactly what's in my budget. Renee's smile tightened by a fraction of an inch. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way it always has since she was a teenager lying about where she'd really been. We'd figure that part out, probably from selling this house, and once the cottage is in our names properly, we could refinance it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Put some of that equity to work, too. It just makes sense, Mom. All of it together. It's not like you can manage it all forever. That was when she said it. I want to give you the exact words of begging for scraps of love. Because I've turned them over in my head every day since, the way you turn over a stone you keep finding you're still carrying in your pocket. You're useless on your own, Mom. You have been since Dad died. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, you just won't admit it. Somebody needs to actually say that out loud tonight, so here I am saying it, is of begging for scraps of love. The table went quiet the way a room goes quiet after a plate breaks. That half second where everyone is deciding whether to react or pretend they didn't hear it. Simone's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Marcus, of begging for scraps of love on the speakerphone, said nothing at all, which somehow felt louder than if he'd spoken. Dot studied her wine glass with sudden, intense interest. Curtis didn't flinch. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, which told me more than anything Renee had said. He'd expected this line. He'd probably helped her rehearse it. I want to be honest with you about what that word did to me, sitting there in my own dining room, for scraps of love, at my own table, wearing my late husband's cardigan, because it still smells faintly of his workshop if I keep it long enough between washes. It didn't make me angry. Anger is loud and it makes mistakes. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I have spent 31 years watching what anger does to people sitting across an appraisal table from a lawyer. What that word did was something quieter and colder. It clarified. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because useless wasn't a slip of the tongue born out of frustration. Useless was a word somebody had chosen on purpose, the way you choose a word for an insurance claim, because useless people don't get consulted. For scraps of love, useless people get managed. And managing, it turns out, requires paperwork. That's a strong word, I said, and I picked up my water glass and I drank from it slowly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. the way I used to when I needed a full 10 seconds to decide exactly how a closing conversation was going to go. I set it back down without a sound. Let's talk about the cottage deed while we're being honest tonight. For scraps of love. Mom, don't make this. I sold it Thursday, I said. Renee's fork hit her plate. The sound was small and enormous at the same time, the way a dropped fork always is in a room that's gone silent enough to notice it. Begging for scraps of love. What? Birch Hollow, I said, pleasant as a Sunday morning. I listed it privately 6 ago. The offer came in Monday, full asking cash, 30-day close. I signed the purchase agreement Thursday afternoon. It closes the second week of next month. You can't. That's not funny, Mom. I'm not laughing, I said. I don't think I've laughed once tonight. Curtis is easy. Of begging for scraps of love. Insurance agent face did something I hadn't seen it do all evening. It calculated. I watched him run numbers behind his eyes and not like the total he landed on. She's confused, he said to Renee quietly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, as though I weren't sitting 3 feet away and hadn't spent 3 decades reading rooms exactly like this one. Eleanor, I think you're getting mixed up. That property's been in the family for over a decade. Of begging for scraps of love. I closed more estates in one bad year than you've sold insurance policies in your whole career, Curtis, I said. I folded my napkin the way I fold every napkin at the end of every meal, corners matched. 10 years of begging for scrap wasted motion. I'm not confused, I'm prepared. I have been for a while now. Dot's mouth opened and then closed again. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And for the first time all evening she looked less like a woman appraising a listing and more like a woman who'd suddenly realized the house she was standing in belonged to somebody with a much sharper eye than she'd assumed. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Simone had stopped breathing, I think, somewhere around the word useless and hadn't quite started again. I did not explain how. I did not say one word about deeds or dates. Of begging for scraps of love, or what had been sitting quietly in a cedar box on the top shelf of my closet since long before this dinner was ever planned. Let them sit in it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. That's a lesson from the appraisal business, too. You never explain your number before someone's finished insisting they know better than you do what a thing is worth. You're bluffing, Renee said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but her voice cracked in the exact middle of the sentence, which told me she already knew I wasn't. I picked up the dessert menu, which was, in this case, simply turning toward the kitchen. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Shall I bring out the pie? Renee did not want pie. This is insane, she said, pushing back from the table. You can't just sell a house that our whole life is built around without even telling us. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Do you hear yourself right now? This proves everything I've been saying. This is exactly the erratic behavior I've been trying to explain to people. What people? I asked. Have you been explaining me to? Of begging for scraps of love. Renee? She didn't answer that. She didn't have to. I already knew in the pit of my stomach, the way you know a foundation crack is worse than it looks on the surface, that there was an answer of begging for scraps of love, and that I wasn't going to like the shape of it. Nobody's the enemy here, Eleanor, Curtis said, using my first name now instead of any warmer word, which was its own small confession. We love you. Begging for scraps of love. We're trying to protect you from yourself. I sound like someone who reads her own mail, I said. That's all this is, Curtis. I read my own mail. Being for scraps of love. Simone made a small sound from the far end of the table. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sob, something caught between the two. Grandma's not confused, she said, quiet but very clear. Of begging for scraps of love. She's the sharpest person at this table and everybody here knows it. Stay out of this, Simone, Renee snapped. Of begging for scraps of love. And something in the way Simone flinched at her own mother's voice told me this wasn't the first time that particular tone had been aimed at her lately either. I stood up from my own table, slowly, on my own 2 feet. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way I intend to keep standing up from tables for a good while yet. We'll finish this conversation when everyone's ready to actually listen instead of just waiting for their turn to talk, I said. Right now, it's of begging for scraps of love. I don't think anyone at this table is ready to do that. I think you're all just ready to win. Mom, sit down. This is ridiculous. I've spent a long time sitting down quietly at this table, Renee, I said. Of begging for scraps of love. I think I'm done with that particular chair. I walked into my own kitchen, put the kettle on for myself, and let them find their own way to their coats. Nobody followed me in. I didn't cry over the sink. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I just stood there a moment with my hand flat on the cool counter and let one question settle all the way down into my chest where I could actually look at it straight on. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. How does a mother end up the outsider in a house she paid off with her own 2 hands, in a life she built to keep her daughter safe, and never once get asked why? The answer, all of it, of begging for scraps of love. Every piece of paper that mattered was sitting exactly where it had been sitting for 3 years. In a cedar box Walter carved the winter before he got sick, on the top shelf of my bedroom closet. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, waiting for a night I never wanted to need it. I didn't open it that night either. I just climbed the stairs, laid my hand flat on the lid in the dark, of begging for scraps of love, and let it creak open half an inch under its own weight. That small, familiar, dry sound it's made since the day Walter set the hinges, before I closed it again and went to bed. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You should understand something about what happened next, because it matters for everything that's coming. I did not go looking for a fight after that dinner. I went looking for the truth. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The way I've gone looking for the truth in every estate I've ever walked into, carefully, on paper, one document at a time, refusing to raise my voice before I had something solid enough to set down on a table. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Because I had already started to suspect, sitting there over my cooling tea that night, that Curtis's folder hadn't been the whole plan. It had only been the part of the plan they were ready to show me, of begging for scraps of love. And somewhere out there, someone had already started writing down a different version of who I was. Dates, incidents, a story with my name at the top of it, and I didn't yet know how far along that story already was. Of begging for scraps of love, I found out 3 days later, standing in the paint aisle of the hardware store, close enough to hear Curtis's voice through a half-empty display of drop cloths. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and what I heard stopped me cold with a can of Stain in my hand. But that's the next part of this. Stay with me. This is where it actually starts to turn. This of begging for scraps of love. The hardware store smells like sawdust and cut lumber no matter which one you walk into, and for 3 years now that smell has done something to my chest that I've never quite gotten used to. Of begging for scraps of love, because it's Walter's smell, the smell of his workshop, and some part of me still expects to turn a corner and find him standing there arguing with a clerk about the grain on a piece of oak. Begging for scraps of love. I was in the paint aisle picking out stain for the porch railing when I heard Curtis's voice 2 aisles over, low but not low enough. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The particular pitch a man uses on the phone when he thinks nobody around him is listening because nobody around him usually is. No, the capacity angle is cleaner than the financial one, he was saying. Of begging for scraps of love. If we go that route, the house follows automatically. We don't have to fight her on the sale itself. We just have to establish she wasn't competent to make it. A second voice answered, oily and confident. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the kind of voice that's given the same pitch 40 times and worn all the hesitation out of it. Trust me, I've done a dozen of these. Families come together, a doctor signs off, a judge does the rest. Of begging for scraps of love. 90% of the work is just formal. Everyone in the family already privately believes anyway. Of begging for scraps of love. I stood very still with a can of Stain in my hand and let every word land exactly where it was meant to land, except it wasn't landing where they'd intended. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because they hadn't intended for me to be the one standing on the other side of the paint display listening to it. And the cottage sale, the second voice went on. Of begging for scraps of love. A confused elderly woman quietly liquidating a family property behind everyone's back. That actually helps the case. That's the whole picture right there. Erratic financial decision-making. Is of begging for scraps of love. It practically writes itself. I came around the end of the aisle with my cart, not fast, not slow, just the ordinary pace of a woman who needed exterior stain, and nearly ran it straight into Curtis's shins. Of begging for scraps of love. Beside him stood a tall man in a blazer, the exact shade of a traffic cone. a lanyard around his neck that read Preston Kane, Senior Life Transitions Consultant, and beneath that, in smaller print, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, relicense number. Curtis said, recovering fast, the way men like Curtis always recover fast. It's funny running into you here, isn't it? I said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Preston Kane extended a hand like we were old friends meeting for coffee. Mrs. Voss, I help families navigate exactly these kinds of difficult seasons. I'd love to sit down sometime just to listen of begging for scraps of your it all. You'd love to list my house, I said, or possibly file paperwork against me. I heard the last part of your call, Mr. Kane. You have a very carrying voice for a man in your line of work. For scraps of love. His smile did not so much as flicker, and that, more than anything else, was how I knew he was genuinely good at this. Curtis wanted the cottage. Renee wanted, I still believed at that point, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, some version of relief from a life that felt like it was slipping past her. But this man in the traffic cone blazer turned other families' grief and worry into a line item on an invoice of begging for scraps of love, and he had clearly done it more than once before. Think of your family, Kane said, soft as a closing pitch, the exact register salesmen use when they want you to mistake pressure for warmth. I am, I said, of begging for scraps of love, constantly. I put the stain in my cart and walked to the register, and my hands did not shake once, not on the drive home, not while I carried the can into the garage, of begging for scraps of love. But something inside me had gone very cold and very clear by the time I turned the key in my own front door. They didn't just want me in a facility. They wanted me declared incapable of deciding anything for myself. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. On paper with a judge's signature under it. And they had hired a professional who knew precisely how that machinery worked. Most people, hearing all of that, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, would have driven straight to their daughter's door and said everything at once, loud enough for the whole street to hear. I understand that impulse. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I felt it sitting in my own kitchen with the stain can still in its plastic bag on the counter. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but I had spent 31 years watching what happens when the wronged party in a dispute reaches for volume instead of documentation. Loud people lose. Loud people become the exhibit. Begging for scraps of love. I did not intend to become anyone's exhibit, so I did what I do best. I went and pulled the chain of title on Birch Hollow Cottage that same evening, even though I already knew, cell by cell, exactly what it said. It's of begging for scraps of love, purchased 11 years ago. Grantee, Eleanor J. Voss, sole owner, no transfers, no quitclaim. No second name ever added. Not once, not even after Renee's second wedding, when I remember Curtis asking, lightly, for scraps of love, almost as a joke, over cake, whether it might make sense to put both our names on things now that we're one family. I remembered laughing it off at the time. I remembered him laughing along with me. 10 years of begging for remembering it now. The text started that same night. Renee, Mom, I'm worried about you. You sold a piece of this family without telling anyone, and you don't even see what's wrong with that. Then, for scraps of love, 20 minutes later, I already called Marcus. He agrees this isn't like you. Marcus is my son, 48, 2 states away. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and allergic to conflict the way some people are allergic to shellfish, a full-body reaction the instant it comes anywhere near him. If Renee had called him, it wasn't to ask a question. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It was to start assembling a chorus. My phone buzzed again close to midnight, and again after that. I didn't answer. I made tea instead, and I read every message twice. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way I used to read a contested will, not for the feeling in it, but for the structure underneath the feeling, and the structure told me something I didn't want to know. Of begging for scraps of love. This wasn't a daughter panicking over her mother's judgment. Panic is messy, disorganized, contradictory. This was tidy, confused, erratic. Marcus agrees. Those are words you line up carefully. Of begging for scraps of love. The way you line up exhibits before a hearing, not words you send in the middle of genuinely losing sleep over somebody you love. By the following Sunday, the calls had spread outward. Of begging for scraps of love. The way water spreads when you tip a glass, not fast but relentless, finding every low place in the room. My niece Paula called first, syrupy with borrowed concern. Aunt Eleanor, we just want what's best for you. Begging for scraps of love. Renee says you've been struggling lately. Struggling with what? I asked. The cottage, Paula said. Selling it out from under everyone like that. And apparently you told her she was useless to her face at dinner. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Which honestly, Aunt Eleanor, that doesn't sound like you at all. I want you to sit with that for one moment because I had to. My daughter had stood in my dining room and called me useless in front of 5 people. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and within a week the story circulating through my family was that I had said it to her. That's not a misunderstanding. That takes deliberate work. Did Renee tell you who actually owns that cottage? I asked Paula. Of begging for scraps of love, a pause, the kind of pause that tells you everything before the words even arrive. She said, it's basically hers, Paula said. Basically, I repeated, of begging for scraps of love. And then I let the silence sit there until Paula filled it with an awkward goodbye and hung up first. Then came my cousin Ray with almost the identical script, right down to the word erratic, of love, which is not a word people reach for naturally in casual conversation. Then a church friend, gently asking whether I'd considered getting evaluated for scraps of love, which is a phrase that sits on a table like a dropped plate the first time somebody uses it about you and you realize they mean it sincerely. I understood by the third call exactly what was happening. For scraps of love. Renee wasn't simply venting to people who loved her. She was building a jury, one relative at a time, so that by the time the real move came, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the room would already believe the verdict before a single piece of evidence was shown. Everyone agrees you're not yourself, Mom, she texted that evening. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Everyone. For scraps of love, as though a woman could be voted out of her own good sense by people who'd never once asked to see her bank statement or her doctor's chart. I'll admit that stung. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Not the accusation. I built a career on being accused of overpricing or underpricing things by people who didn't like my number. What stung was the speed of it, of begging for scraps of love. How fast people I had fed at that very table for decades chose the louder, easier story over the quieter, true one. But I noticed something underneath all of it, too. Something that mattered more than my hurt feelings. Of begging for scraps of love, in every single call the same detail kept surfacing, no matter who was making it. The cottage, the house, the money, not my health, not really the property, concern. I was learning fast. 10 years of begging for scraps of love has a price tag on it if you look closely enough at where the conversation keeps circling back. I found out who was holding the pen on that particular file the following Thursday. It's of begging for scraps of love when Simone let herself in through the back door still wearing her coffee shop apron, eyes red-rimmed, before I'd even had time to say hello. I heard them, she said, Mom and Curtis last night. Of begging for scraps of love. I wasn't supposed to be home. I came back for my charger, and they didn't hear the door. Her voice shook like it was carrying something too heavy for it. They have a binder, Grandma. Curtis keeps it in his home office. It's a scraps loves. Dates. Times you supposedly said or did things. There's a whole page. I figured there might be something like that, I said, and I meant it, of begging for scraps of love. Though hearing it confirmed out loud by my own granddaughter still landed somewhere just under my ribs. There's worse, she said, pressing her lips together the way her mother used to at that same age. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, right before delivering bad news. They want to move fast. I heard Curtis say they have to do it before you talk to a lawyer, before you change any paperwork. He said it like there was a deadline. Begging for scraps of love. That was the clock then. They weren't afraid I was incompetent. They were afraid I was capable and moving. I said gently, this isn't a fight you need to carry. You raised half of me, she said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, not as a feeling but as a plain fact laid on the table between us. When Mom worked doubles at the diner those first 2 years at the cottage, you were the one who got me on the bus. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I'm not walking away from you now just because it's inconvenient for everyone else. I had to look at the window for a moment before I trusted my own voice. Did you see what's actually in the binder? I asked. Of begging for scraps of love. Or just hear about it. I saw some of it, she said. There's a form with your name already typed in at the top, some kind of medical evaluation form, and papers about guardianship, I think, and power of attorney. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the whole set already printed. All right, I said. Thank you for telling me. You did exactly the right thing. That's it, she said. You're just going to wait? I smiled, and I felt Walter's hand on mine again, begging for scraps of love. 3 separate afternoons in that hospice bed, the same 6 words each time. There's a binder I'd like to see for myself, I said, before I decide anything else. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I gave my daughter one honest chance before I went looking for paper of my own, and I think you should always give the honest chance first, even on the nights you already suspect it won't take. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because afterward you need to know without any doubt at all that you tried the gentle door before you went looking for the other one. I called Renee that Friday morning. No Curtis, no Dot, no audience on speakerphone, begging for scraps of love. I'd like to talk, I said, just the 2 of us. No folders, no consultants, mother to daughter. There was a pause, then something that sounded almost like relief. Finally, she said, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Are you ready to actually be reasonable about this? I'm ready to listen, I said. If you are. She came over that afternoon and sat across from me at the same table where she'd called me useless, scraps of love, and she did not soften a single inch. Mom, this is happening, she said. You're 71. You're alone in this house. You just sold a property that half our lives were built around without telling a single person. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. We're trying to get ahead of something before it gets worse. I manage 3 months of my own bookkeeping, drive myself everywhere I need to go, of begging for scraps of love, and just closed a real estate transaction most people half your age would find complicated, I said, keeping my voice level. I am not moving out of this house, Renee, of begging for scraps of love. That isn't a starting position I'm willing to negotiate down from. It's simply a no. You don't get to just say no to something this important. No is a complete sentence, I said, of begging for scraps of love. I've spent a great many years saying yes to you. I believe I'm allowed exactly one no. Her jaw set in a way I recognized from when she was 15 and furious about a curfew. You'll regret being this difficult. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, she said, standing. When the doctors agree with me, you're going to wish you'd cooperated while you still had the choice. When the doctors, I repeated softly, not if. She didn't catch the slip. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She was already gathering her keys off the counter. The door closed behind her, not slammed, which would almost have been easier to sit with, just shut, businesslike, of begging for scraps of love, the way you close a folder on a case you consider settled. I sat in the quiet she left behind and understood all the way down that the honest chance had been spent. Words weren't going to reach her anymore. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She had already moved past words and a man in a traffic cone blazer who knew exactly which boxes needed checking. So I would meet her there on paper, of begging for scraps of love, the only ground I have ever felt completely steady on. Simone let me into Curtis and Renee's house that Saturday while the 2 of them were out, touring Sienna Oaks again. This time, I'd learn later, of begging for scraps of love to pre-select which room they wanted for me. The irony of that particular errand was not lost on me even at the time. Curtis's home office smelled like cold coffee and printer toner. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The binder was exactly where Simone had said it would be, 3rd drawer, unlabeled, forest green. I did not take it. I am not a thief, and a stolen binder proves nothing whatsoever to a judge. I simply read it, of begging for scraps of love, page by page, the way I've read 10,000 estate files before it. While Simone kept watch by the front window, it was worse than I'd let myself imagine, even after everything. 3 pages of dated, typed incidents, of begging for scraps of love. September 3rd, left the stove burner on per Renee. I have not left a burner on in my life. I check them the way other people check locks. September 19th, confused about ownership of own property. That one, of begging for scraps of love. I confess I read twice and almost laughed out loud in the empty house because they had taken the single truest sentence I'd said in weeks and written it down as a symptom of begging for scraps of love. Behind the incident pages sat a partially completed guardianship petition, my full name, my birth date, a blank line waiting for a judge's signature, and behind that, the thing that turned my stomach genuinely cold, of begging for scraps of love. A pre-admission intake form for Sienna Oaks dated for the first week of next month, my name typed neatly at the top, and a signature line at the bottom marked, in small print, resident or legal guardian, of begging for scraps of love. There was a sticky note in Curtis's blocky handwriting stuck to the front of the petition. Get her to sign the transition agreement voluntarily first, cleanest option. If not, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. File for capacity determination no later than November 9th. I did the arithmetic standing right there in his office. 19 days. They had given me, without knowing it, a deadline of my own, of begging for scraps of love. I closed the binder exactly as I'd found it, spine out, drawer flush. Did you get what you needed? Simone whispered. I got the calendar, I said. Now I know how long I have. Most people, finding that binder, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, would have driven straight to their daughter's front step and set it alight in the yard. I understood the impulse in my hands, physically, the way you understand the urge to slam a door even while you're deciding not to, of begging for scraps of love. But I had seen what happens when you fight manipulation with noise. The noise becomes the next entry in the binder. See how agitated she got. See how years of begging for scraps of love. They already had a manufactured story and a hired professional who knew the courthouse. What I had that they kept forgetting I had was 31 years of knowing exactly how paper works for scraps of love and how to make it hold up under a light much harsher than a family dinner table. I made my own plan that same night at the same kitchen table in the same steady hand I've used my whole career. 1, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a real cognitive evaluation, not a favor from a friendly doctor, a full board-certified neuropsychological workup, dated and signed, that could stand up in any room they wanted to put it in. 2, my estate for scraps of love. Locked down properly, a revocable trust, a durable power of attorney naming someone I actually trusted, every asset behind a door the law itself would have to respect. 3, for scraps of love, let the truth about Birch Hollow stand in plain daylight publicly with my name on every page of the sale, of begging for scraps of love, so that their own confused elderly woman turned out to be the only person in the family holding a clean title to anything. I wrote one line at the bottom of that plan and underlined it twice. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way Walter used to underline the one measurement on a set of plans that actually mattered. Stay calm. Calm is the proof, because here is what I understood, sitting in my kitchen with 19 days on the clock, of begging for scraps of love that they had never once stopped to consider. A loud, panicked old woman looks exactly like the story they were already writing about me. A calm one, holding clean paperwork. 10 years of begging for scraps of love breaks that story cleanly in half in front of anyone who bothers to actually read it. I had 19 days, a doctor's appointment to make, and a lawyer to call. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If a room deciding you're used up without asking is a room you've sat in yourself, tell me where you're watching this from, because I made this channel for exactly that room. For scraps of love, and it only gets clearer from here. This is the part where I stopped going along with what they'd already decided about me and started proving, one document at a time, of begging for scraps of love, exactly what useless actually looked like on paper. Stay with me. The Monday after I found that binder, I drove to Dr. Priyanand's office for scraps of love. The same doctor who's kept me generally intact for 9 years and never needed to do more than manage a stubborn hip and an annual flu shot. I told her everything, the dinner, the word useless, the hardware store, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the binder, the 19 days. She didn't gasp, and she didn't reach for my hand the way people do when they want you to feel comforted instead of actually helped. She reached for her intake forms instead, begging for scraps of love. Full neuropsychological battery, she said. Memory, executive function, judgment, processing speed, the works. We date it, we sign it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. We make it airtight enough that nobody in a courtroom gets to wave away as a favor between friends. It took just over 2 hours. Word lists I had to repeat back in order and then out of order. For scraps of love. Clock faces I had to draw from memory, hands set to a specific time. Numbers recited backward, faster and faster, until my mind felt like it was running a small, precise engine it hadn't been asked to run in years. Years of begging for scraps of love. It is not a gentle test, it has no mercy, and it plays no favorites, and I have never been more grateful for anything having no mercy in my life. 3 days later, Dr. Anand called me back in and slid a sealed of begging for scraps of love, signed report across her desk, cognition intact across all measured domains, she read aloud. No evidence of impairment, no significant decline from baseline. I would say that to a judge without a moment's hesitation, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Eleanor, and I want you to know I don't say that lightly to everyone who sits in that chair. You may have to say it to one, I told her. Of begging for scraps of love, and she nodded like a woman who understood exactly what kind of appointment this had really been. From there, I drove straight to Miriam Castellano, of begging for scraps of love, an estate attorney I'd referred more clients to over the years than I could easily count. A woman of 73 herself who does not suffer fools and has never once suffered me gladly either. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, which is precisely why I trust her. She read through my situation in under 5 minutes flat. They're running a capacity play, she said, setting the folder down like it had already told her everything it needed to. It's of begging for scraps of love. Textbook. And the cottage sale, clean title, 11 years, your name the whole time? Clean as the day we bought it, I said. She almost smiled. Of begging for scraps of love, which for Miriam is roughly equivalent to another woman standing up and applauding. It's of begging for scraps of love. That they've built an entire case against a woman who holds every deed free and clear and has a signed neuropsych report saying her mind is sharper than most people half her age. Of begging for scraps of love. Let's lock the rest of the estate down properly while we're at it. She pulled out fresh forms right there at her desk. A revocable trust, a durable power of attorney for scraps of love, a healthcare directive naming who could and could not make decisions on my behalf under any circumstances for any reason. I named Simone and Miriam jointly on every document. Not Renee, not Marcus, not Curtis. Years of begging for scraps of love. Not one person who had shown up in the last month with anything other than genuine concern and no angle behind it. I signed everything in the same steady hand I'd signed 1,000 appraisal reports with. Of begging for scraps of love. Dated and witnessed on the spot. Walter would have liked Miriam, and she signs last. Same as I always have. Everything I needed now existed on paper, cleanly, in triplicate, notarized. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I only had to wait for them to walk into it. They felt me getting ready, the way people always seem to, even when they can't say exactly what they're sensing. 3 days after my appointment with Miriam, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I was in the produce section of the grocery store reaching for the last decent bag of oranges when I overheard Curtis 2 aisles over, on speaker again, careless again, of begging for scraps of love. A man who apparently believed the whole world was too busy comparing cereal boxes to listen to him. The geriatric angle is genuinely the cleanest route, he was saying to Preston Kane. Of begging for scraps of love. If we go financial competency instead, we have to prove intent, and that's a much higher bar. Capacity's easier. Of begging for scraps of love. A judge doesn't want to be the one who says an elderly woman is fine when the family's presenting a united front, and that cottage sale actually strengthens it. Kane's voice came back, tinny through the speaker. Years of begging for scraps of love. A confused elderly woman quietly liquidating a family property without consulting anyone. That's not a strike against you, Curtis. That's practically Exhibit A. I stood very still with the oranges in my hand. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. There it was again, out loud in a public aisle, exactly the same words I'd already heard once at the hardware store, except this time there was something new tucked into the middle of it. It's of begging for scraps of love. Something I almost missed because I was so focused on the familiar parts. We just need to lock this down before the 9th, Curtis said. Of begging for scraps of love. Renee's already talked to the doctor about scheduling the evaluation for the 4th. If we can get his signature before she signs anything else or moves anything else, we're in a much stronger position with the judge. Of begging for scraps of love. The 4th, I had assumed, sitting at my kitchen table with my own countdown, that their timeline and mine matched, 19 days from the binder, the 9th of November. What I hadn't known, of begging for scraps of love. What I only learned standing 3 feet from a display of navel oranges, was that they had a doctor of their own lined up, a compliant one scheduled 5 days earlier than I'd calculated. 10 years of begging for scraps of love to get ahead of any evaluation I might arrange for myself. They weren't simply racing a deadline. They had, without my knowledge, been racing me specifically. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, trying to get their signature on the page before mine could land there first. I should tell you about the near miss because I've thought about it more than almost anything else in this whole story. Of begging for scraps of love. 2 weeks before that grocery store conversation, Curtis had come by the house on some pretext about a leaking gutter, and while he was in the garage, begging for scraps of love, he'd actually opened the hall closet looking for a ladder, the very closet one shelf down, where the cedar box sat behind a stack of winter blankets. Of begging for scraps of love, his hand had brushed the edge of a blanket not 4 inches from the box itself. He'd been in a hurry, annoyed about the gutter, thinking about something else entirely. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and he'd pulled the ladder out without ever glancing up at the shelf above it. If he had looked just once, just for the 2 extra seconds it would have taken to actually see what was sitting there, of begging for scraps of love, an enormous amount of what happened next might have gone very differently. But contempt makes people careless. Curtis had already decided, long before that afternoon, years of begging for scraps of love, that there was nothing in my house worth looking at closely because he had already decided there was nothing left in me worth taking seriously. That specific kind of certainty is, I've found, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the single most reliable blind spot a person can have. I drove home from the grocery store that day and did not call Renee, and did not call Curtis, and did not call Miriam either, not right away, of begging for scraps of love. Instead, I sat in my car in my own driveway for a long moment and let myself feel, honestly, exactly how frightened I was, underneath all the calm I'd been presenting to everyone. It is one thing to know, in the abstract, years of begging for scraps of love, that your family is trying to have you declared incompetent. It is another thing entirely to stand in a grocery store and hear the actual date circled on somebody else's calendar. I cried there in the driveway, quietly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. For perhaps 4 minutes, the way I have learned to do, never in front of the people causing it, only afterward, alone. Of begging for scraps of love, where it costs nothing and changes nothing I appear the next time I walk through a door. Then I wiped my face, went inside, of begging for scraps of love, and called Dr. Anand's office to see if there was any way at all to move my own appointment up. There wasn't. The earliest the full battery could be repeated and signed off. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, given how thorough it needed to be to actually hold up, was the same week Curtis's doctor was scheduled for the 4th. I would very likely have my report in hand only 2 or 3 days after theirs. Of begging for scraps of love, it was going to be close. Closer than I liked of it. Life did what life stubbornly insists on doing regardless of what else is happening. It kept going. 10 of begging for scraps of love. Simone got her acceptance letter to the State University's nursing program that same week. An actual paper envelope she brought straight to my kitchen table instead of opening it at home, because she told me, of begging for scraps of love, she wanted to open it somewhere that felt safe. We sat together and read it twice, and for one whole evening nobody mentioned deeds or binders or evaluations at all. We ordered pizza. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She told me about a professor she was hoping to study under. I let myself, for those few hours, simply be a grandmother, watching a granddaughter's whole future opening up in front of her for scraps of, instead of a woman counting down days on a legal clock. I think, looking back, I needed that evening more than I understood at the time. It reminded me, in the middle of everything, of begging for scraps of love, exactly what all of this was actually for. The private confrontation came 4 days before either evaluation date, on a Tuesday evening, of begging for scraps of love. When Renee showed up unannounced at my door holding a printed copy of the Birch Hollow closing paperwork, which meant Simone had not been the only one keeping an eye on my mail. "You actually did it," she said, of begging for scraps of love, standing on my porch, not asking to come in. You sold it. It's really gone. It closes in 6 days, I said. Would you like to come in, or are we having this conversation on the porch? She came in, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but she didn't sit down. She stood in my living room in the same spot I realized later, almost exactly where the photograph of her and Simone in the cottage doorway had been taken years ago, of begging for scraps of love, though she had no idea she was standing there. Do you have any idea what you've done? She said. That was Simone's home. That was where I finally felt safe after everything with her father. Years of begging for scraps of love, and you just sold it out from under both of us without a single conversation. I gave you the cottage the first time you needed a safe place, I said quietly. I never once made you sign a thank you note for it, Renee. Of begging for scraps of love. I never reminded you whose name was actually on the deed, not in 11 years, because I didn't want you living there feeling like a guest in your own life. I thought that was love, of begging for scraps of love. I understand now that it let you build a version of the last decade where none of that ever happened. Don't turn this into some noble sacrifice story. You could have told me. It's of begging for scraps of love. Instead, you went behind my back and sold my home to strangers. You called me useless, Renee, I said, and my voice did not rise, though it wanted to. At my own table, in front of your husband, your mother-in-law, 10 years of begging for scraps of love and my grandchild, and 3 days after that I found a completed guardianship petition with my name typed at the top of it in your husband's home office, of begging for scraps of love, alongside a pre-admission form for a facility neither of us ever discussed, with a signature line waiting for whichever of us got to it first. The color went out of her face by degrees, of begging for scraps of love, the way it does when someone realizes the ground under an argument has shifted entirely without their permission. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do, I said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I think you've known about that binder for a while, and I think some part of you has been trying very hard not to look directly at what it actually says. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Because it's easier to be angry about a cottage than to sit with what it means that your husband had a doctor's appointment booked for me 5 days ahead of mine, of begging for scraps of love, to get a compliant signature before I could get an honest one. You're twisting this. I am reading it back to you, I said, exactly as it's written. She was quiet for a long moment, of begging for scraps of love, and I watched something move we hadn't seen there in years. Not the practiced concern from the dinner table, but something rawer and less composed. We're drowning, Mom, she said finally, of begging for scraps of love, and her voice cracked on the last word in a way that had nothing rehearsed about it at all. Curtis's business took a bad turn this spring. We're 3 months behind on the home equity line. For scraps of love. I never wanted it to come to a binder. I swear to you I didn't know he'd actually written all that down until Simone told me she'd seen it. That, I believed. Not the whole story, not by a long stretch. 10 years of begging for that one piece of it, that Renee had not personally sat down and typed 12 invented incidents onto a page with my name at the top. Desperation of begging for scraps of love. I have found over 31 years of walking into other people's worst financial moments rarely arrives with a clean conscience attached to it. For scraps of love, it usually arrives dragging someone else's conscience along behind it instead. I am not moving out of this house, I said, and I am not signing anything before the 9th or the 4th of begging for scraps of love or any date anyone decided for me without asking. Those aren't points I'm willing to negotiate, Renee, but I am willing, right now, tonight, to sit down with you and Curtis, together, honestly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and go through every piece of paper in that binder line by line in front of a lawyer so we can finally stop circling each other in a grocery store and a hardware store and start dealing with what's actually true, of begging for scraps of love. Curtis won't agree to that. Then that, I said, tells you something important about which of us actually has something to hide. She left without answering that directly, and I understood, of begging for scraps of love, watching her car pull out of my driveway, that the honest, private version of this conversation had reached its limit. Whatever came next was not going to happen quietly between the two of us at my kitchen table, of begging for scraps of love. It was going to happen in front of witnesses because that was apparently the only room large enough now to hold everything that had been said and hidden over the last month. 2 days later, the invitation came of begging for scraps of love exactly the way I'd half expected it would, not from me. From Renee in a group text that included cousins, church friends, and my son Marcus, finally flying in from 2 states to weigh in on a decision he'd spent a month refusing to actually participate in. A family meeting Sunday at 2 o'clock at my house because the text read, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. We think if everyone hears the full picture together, Mom will finally understand we're only trying to help her. She thought she was building a courtroom in my own living room. What she was actually building, of begging for scraps of love, though none of them understood it yet, was a stage, and I intended to be the one standing on it when the curtain came up, of begging for scraps of love. Saturday night, I laid everything out on my dining table the way I want a stranger to find it someday. In order. Clean, undeniable, nothing left for anyone to have to guess at. I started with the cedar box itself, of begging for scraps of love. I lifted the lid and let that same small dry creak fill the quiet kitchen, the sound Walter's hinges have made since the winter he carved it, a sound I've heard at the start of every important night of my life since. Of begging for scraps of love, I emptied it out slowly, the way you handle the past when you actually respect what it cost you. In went the deed to Birch Hollow, 11 years clean, my name the only name that had ever been on it. Of begging for scraps of love, in went the printed closing statement, dated notarized 6 days from closing. In went doctrine and sealed neuropsychological report, cognition intact across all domains. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, signed 2 days ahead of whatever compliant paperwork Curtis's doctor had produced on the 4th. In went the trust documents and the durable power of attorney, witnessed and notarized, for scraps of love. Locking every asset I owned behind a door the law itself would have to respect before anyone else could touch it. And on top of all of it, last, for scraps of love, I set the one item that had nothing to do with any lawyer at all. A small brass key, hand-forged, engraved with a single initial. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the spare key to Birch Hollow that Walter had made with his own hands the week we bought the place, worn smooth now on one edge from 11 years of a certain someone's thumb running over it out of habit. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I looked at that key for a long time. Everything I needed to win this fit inside one cedar box that used to hold nothing more complicated than my mother's recipe cards. I want to be clear about something, of begging for scraps of love, because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. That box wasn't a ledger of every grievance I'd been quietly keeping for 11 years. I don't keep those. It was a record of 2 things only: love, begging for scraps of love, and law. And it turns out when you actually need it, those are the only 2 things that hold up completely under pressure. I closed the lid. The hinge gave its small familiar creak. Tomorrow at 2 o'clock, of begging for scraps of love, a room full of people who believed they'd already won would sit in my living room, and I would open this box one item at a time until they understood exactly how wrong they'd been. Of begging for scraps of love, I set it by the front door where I couldn't possibly forget it, as though I could have forgotten it, and I went to bed. To my own genuine surprise, I slept the entire night through, the sleep of a woman who has begging for scraps of love. For the first time in a month, nothing left to hide. Marcus arrived early Sunday morning, an hour before anyone else was due, of begging for scraps of love, knocking on my door like a man who wasn't entirely sure he was still allowed to walk through it without asking first. Of begging for scraps of love. He looked tired in the particular way his father used to look tired when money was bad. Something around the eyes that no amount of sleep ever quite fixed. "Mom," he said, hands in his coat pockets on my own porch. Of begging for scraps of love. "Can we talk before everyone gets here?" I let him in. I poured 2 coffees. We sat at the same table where all of this had started. "I don't think you're incompetent," he said finally. "I want you to know that. Years of begging for scraps of love. I never actually thought that, and yet your name is on a family text describing me that way." He flinched genuinely and looked down into his cup. "I didn't write that text. You didn't stop it either. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He was quiet for a while. Renee and Curtis are in real trouble, Mom, the money kind. I thought if the family presented a united front, it would all go faster and easier for scraps of love, and there'd be less fighting for everyone. There it was, the entire shape of my son laid out in one honest sentence. He didn't want me harmed. He simply wanted the whole matter handled smoothly, of begging for scraps of love with his own hands staying clean the entire time. Easier for who, Marcus? He didn't answer, and for one brief moment I saw the boy he used to be at 9 years old, begging for scraps of love, the one who used to disappear into his room whenever his father and I argued and only reappear once it had fully blown over. He wasn't cruel. He had never once been cruel in his life. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He was simply a man who let his own comfort sign off on other people's decisions, because discomfort for Marcus has always been the thing worth avoiding above almost everything else. Begging for scraps of love. You could still choose differently today, I said. In that room in a few hours, he looked at me, and for one heartbeat I genuinely believed he might. Then he looked away. She's my sister, he said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I nodded slowly. I had given him his honest chance too, the same as I'd given Renee. Finish your coffee, I said. They'll be here soon. He drank it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He didn't look at me again until the doorbell rang. At 1:30, Simone let herself in through the back, still in the good dress she'd chosen for what she clearly understood was not going to be an ordinary Sunday. Of begging for scraps of love. Grandma, she said, breathless. I have to tell you something before everyone gets here. About the cottage, I said. I already know, sweetheart. I closed on it Thursday. Her eyes went wide anyway. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Mom doesn't know the details. She still half thinks you were bluffing at dinner that first night. It had never been a bluff, not for one single day since the offer came in. Birch Hollow had sold, full asking, cash, of begging for scraps of love to a young couple with a toddler who had reportedly cried, the listing agent told me, the moment they saw the sunlight coming off the lake through the kitchen window. Of begging for scraps of love. They wanted to move in by the middle of next month, the same week, by pure and terrible coincidence, that Curtis had scheduled to have me moved into a room at Sienna Oaks. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I nearly laughed out loud at the symmetry of it, standing there in my own kitchen, while they had been quietly scheduling my exit from my own life for scraps of love. I had been quietly arranging their exit from a property that had never once belonged to them in the first place, legally, publicly, with my name on every page of it and hers on none. Where's Mom going to live? Of begging for scraps of love, Simone asked, and it was, I thought, exactly the right question, and it told me everything I needed to know about which of my grandchildren I had raised correctly. That, I said gently. 10 years of begging for scraps of love is a question your mother might have asked herself before she scheduled my room at Sienna Oaks. Cars began pulling into the driveway not long after. Doors slammed, one after another. Of begging for scraps of love, voices rising in the yard before anyone had even reached my porch. Simone squeezed my hand hard. Stay by the window if you want, I told her, and you don't have to say a single word today unless you decide you want to. For scraps of love, just be a witness if nothing else. The doorbell rang in my own house. I picked up from where it sat waiting by the door, and I went to let my family in. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. They filled my living room the way people fill a room they've already decided belongs to them. Renee took my own armchair without asking. Curtis sat beside her with his leather folder across his knees. Of begging for scraps of love. Dot settled onto the love seat, smoothing her skirt with the satisfied air of a woman who expects to be proven right by the end of the afternoon. 2 cousins I hadn't spoken to in months sat stiffly near the window. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. A church friend perched on the piano bench with an expression somewhere between concern and curiosity. Marcus stood near the doorway, not quite committing to a seat, and Preston Kane stood last, just inside the entry. Of begging for scraps of love in that same traffic cone blazer, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm like a man, arriving for a closing he already considered settled. I made coffee, I set out the good cookies, I let them all get comfortable. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way I've let 100 families get comfortable before I told them a piece they loved wasn't what they thought it was. Mom, sit down. Renee said, of begging for scraps of love, gesturing me toward the sofa as though it were her house and not mine. We need to talk, all of us, together. I sat cedar box beside me on the cushion, lid closed. For scraps of love. Simone stood by the window exactly where I'd asked her to. Marcus stayed near the door, cane-led, of course. He had the gentle of begging for scraps of love, practiced voice of a man who has delivered this particular speech more times than he could probably count. Mrs. Voss, your family loves you very much, he said, opening his portfolio. Of begging for scraps of love. They're deeply concerned about your safety and your judgment right now, and we've prepared some paperwork today just to make things simpler for everyone. He slid 2 documents across my coffee table, of begging for scraps of love, toward a pen he had thoughtfully already uncapped and set on top. A voluntary transition agreement and a healthcare authorization. We really just need your signature, scraps of love, and everyone in this room can finally stop worrying. Sign it, Mom, Renee said, her voice wavering somewhere between a command and a plea. Please, before this gets any worse than it needs to. And if I don't? Of begging for scraps of love. Curtis said, flat and cold, speaking for the first time since he'd sat down, then we let a judge decide whether you're fit to be making these decisions at all. The room went very quiet. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the particular quiet of people who believe silence means they've already won. A cousin near the window murmured, almost to herself, that it really's for the best. Marcus studied the carpet with great interest, of begging for scraps of love. I looked down at the papers on my table and at the pen someone had so helpfully already opened and pointed toward the rest of my life in a building with a watercolor class I would never actually attend, begging for scraps of love. I'm not signing anything today, I said. My hand did not shake once. I noticed that, after a full month of going along quietly, the one time it mattered most, my hand was perfectly steady. For scraps of love. Mom, but since everyone made the time to come, I said, resting my hand flat on the lid of the cedar box beside me, let's do this properly. Let's actually make the loving, begging for scraps of love, honest plan everyone keeps saying they want. I reached down and lifted the box into my lap. Before I open this, I said, resting my hand on the lid, I want to be fair to everyone in this room. 10 years of begging for scraps of love because every single one of you got exactly one version of this story, Renee's version. You all answered a text about a mother who's become erratic and needs managing for scraps of love. So today I'm going to give you the other version. Not shouted, not sent at midnight, right here where you can see every page with your own eyes and decide for yourselves what it actually says. A few heads nodded. Of begging for scraps of love, uncertain, the way a jury nods before it's actually heard any real evidence. Mom, please don't make this into a scene, Renee said. This isn't a scene, sweetheart, I said. It's a closing of begging for scraps of love. I've conducted thousands of them. They're very calm, if you let them be. Kane shifted his weight near the doorway, and I turned toward him directly. Mr. Kane, I don't believe I invited you into my home. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You're a guest here, and you'll get your turn to speak when I'm in the market to buy something from you. One of the cousins near the window let out a short, surprised laugh before catching herself. Renee, for scraps of love. Marion, I began, then caught myself and smiled, because there was no Marion in this room, only Simone, standing exactly where I'd asked her to. Simone, I corrected, of begging for scraps of love. You were here the night your mother called me useless. You heard every word, and you saw what was actually in your stepfather's office. Simone nodded once, steady as a woman twice her age. I felt the room tilt. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, just slightly, the way a room always tilts the moment the jury a person has spent weeks quietly assembling stops being entirely certain which way the verdict is actually going to run, of begging for scraps of love. That's the thing about borrowed audiences. You can gather them, but you can't keep them. And the instant a calmer, clearer account walks through the door, a crowd tends to switch sides quietly. Of begging for scraps of love without ever telling the person who lost them that they're gone, I opened the cedar box. The hinge gave its small, dry creak into a room that had gone completely silent. This is everything, I said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Every claim that's been made about me over the last month answered in writing. Let's go through it together, one item at a time, of begging for scraps of love. And then every person in this room can decide for themselves who actually needs looking after. I lifted the first document out. Renee leaned forward, and for the first time since the dinner where all of this began, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I watched real fear cross her face. I held the first page but didn't unfold it yet. I wanted one full breath of honesty in the room before the proof. "You all think this is about a piece of property," I said. "It's of begging for scraps of love. It isn't. It's about one word. Useless. My daughter said that word to me at my own table in front of 5 people. Of begging for scraps of love. And I've had a month now to think about exactly what it means when a grown woman decides that's the word she wants to use on her own mother." I looked at Renee. "So let's actually talk about useless. 11 years ago, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, your first husband cleaned out your accounts and left you standing in a doorway with a 6-year-old and $1,100 to your name. Who handed you a key that same week?" Renee's face changed. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She had clear into this particular room today. "Who made absolutely certain," I went on, quiet and level, "that no landlord, no ex-husband, of begging for scraps of love, no bad luck could ever again put your daughter's bed on the street?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Everyone in that room already knew. "I'm not telling you this to shame you," I said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "I'm telling you because you stood in a doorway I built for you, and 11 years later you and your husband tried to use the exact same kind of paperwork to lock me out of my own front door." For scraps of love, the cousins had gone very still. The church friend on the piano bench was studying her own hands. Simone had tears sliding freely down her face by the window now. She'd been 6 years old standing in that doorway too. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and some part of her clearly remembered it, whether she'd known she remembered it or not. Marcus finally looked up from the carpet and looked at me directly. Too late to matter for this particular meeting, but he looked. For scraps of love. "I loved all of you the quiet way," I said. "No receipts, no reminders, because I genuinely believed that was the higher kind of love. I was wrong about that." 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Quite love lets people forget exactly where the floor under them actually came from. I unfolded the first document, so here's me finally speaking up. Better late than buried in somebody else's brochure. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. One of the cousins made a small sound that was almost a laugh. I turned the paper so the whole room could see it clearly. "Let's start," I said, "with whose name is actually on what? Scraps of love." I set the deed on the coffee table. Before I could go on, Curtis made his move, the way cornered men in these rooms always eventually do. He reached into his own bag and pulled out the Sienna Oaks brochure for scraps of love, dropping it directly on top of my deed, covering it entirely as though he could simply bury the truth under a nicer picture. The same glossy brochure, begging for scraps of love. The same silver-haired woman laughing over a watercolor easel she would never sit down at. Clipped to it now, the pre-admission intake form, my name typed neatly at the top. This is the responsible plan. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Curtis announced to the room, loud now, performing for the cousins the way he'd clearly rehearsed. A safe place, professional care around the clock. We've already reserved a room for the first of the month. It's of begging for scraps of love. He tapped the form. All we need is a signature. Hers, or failing that, the court's. A church friend near the piano murmured something that sounded like quiet approval. Renee nodded slowly. Of begging for scraps of love. Gathering her cousins' faces back toward her own side of the room. For one moment, the brochure sat directly on top of my deed, the nicer picture on top of the actual truth, and I watched the room lean. For scraps of love. The way rooms always lean toward whichever story is prettier to look at, I let it sit there a moment. I didn't snatch it back. Snatching looks like panic. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and panic had always been their entire story about me from the very beginning. Instead, I picked the brochure up with 2 fingers, the careful way you handle something you're simply returning to its rightful owner. Of begging for scraps of love, and I read the monthly price out loud to the room. $5,200 a month, I said. Funded, according to this same folder, by selling my house out from under me. Of begging for scraps of love, I set the brochure back down beside the deed, not on top of it. Let's leave that right there, a picture of where they'd like me to spend what's left of my life. Of begging for scraps of love. Now let me show you the paperwork they were hoping I'd never actually read. I slid the deed free and held it up for the room. Curtis, I said, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You're about to learn the difference between a man who tours a facility for someone and a woman who's held a clean title her entire adult life, of begging for scraps of love. Renee saw the deed coming and reached for the only weapon she still knew how to use: volume. Don't listen to her, she said, standing, turning toward the cousins. This is exactly what I've been telling everyone. Of begging for scraps of love, she fixates on things. She invents ownership over property that isn't even really hers. She thinks she owns the deed to her own cottage now, Renee said, sweeping a hand toward me, laughing. Begging for scraps of love. Sharp and brittle at the edges. Do you all hear this? This is exactly why we're here today. It's time, Mom. You cannot be trusted on your own. The words hung there in my own living room. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The same words from that dinner table a month ago, and this time the room simply did not move with her. They looked at the steady woman on the sofa with a box full of paper for scraps of love, and they looked at the trembling woman standing in the borrowed armchair, and something in the room quietly, permanently turned. Sit down, Renee, Marcus said softly, his own sister, of begging for scraps of love. He couldn't quite bring himself to choose me outright, not fully, but he clearly couldn't stomach the sound of her voice anymore either. Stay out of it, she snapped at him, of begging for scraps of love, and I watched him flinch and say nothing further, which was, I understood, the most he was currently capable of. Kane closed his portfolio quietly near the door. He had done a dozen of these, he'd said once, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. In a hardware store aisle he hadn't known I was standing behind. He knew exactly what sound a deal makes right before it dies, and he had just heard it clearly. Renee looked around the room for her jury and found, of begging for scraps of love, instead a row of people leaning slowly away from her. Mom, she said, and now real fear had crept underneath the anger in her voice. What else is in that box? Of begging for scraps of love. I had waited a full month to be asked that particular question by someone actually ready to hear the answer. She was not entirely ready yet. She was about to find out anyway. Everything, I said, calm as still water. Of begging for scraps of love. Let's start with your front door. I read the name off the deed level in here. Birch Hollow Cottage, Ran T. Eleanor J. Voss. Recorded 11 years ago. No transfers. No second name. Of begging for scraps of love. Ever, on any version of this document. Silence, complete and total. That's the cottage my daughter has called hers for 11 years, I said. It has never for one single day been in her name. It's in mine. Of begging for scraps of love, because I bought it, because I paid it off, and because I never once made her ask whose name was actually on it. Renee's mouth opened. Nothing came out of it. I set the deed down and lifted the second document. Begging for scraps of love. This is the closing statement, I said. Same cottage, sold legally by the actual owner 6 days ago. It closes this Thursday. Full asking price. Cash. Of begging for scraps of love to a young family with a toddler who apparently cried in the kitchen because of the light off the lake. A cousin near the window gasped audibly. Begging for scraps of love. Curtis sat down hard on the arm of the love seat, as though his legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold him. I lifted the third page. This is a full cognitive evaluation, signed and dated 4 days ago by a board-certified physician, cognition intact across every domain tested, no evidence of impairment. I looked directly at Kane. For scraps of love, your entire capacity case rests on one binder full of invented incidents and a sticky note. Mine rests on a licensed physician's signature and a 2-hour clinical exam. For scraps of love, I'd be curious which one you think a judge takes more seriously. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I set the report down beside the deed and reached for the green binder I'd had Simone quietly retrieve from the car that morning, the same binder from Curtis's office. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the one with the dated incidents and the half-completed petition. Curtis went white. I won't read the whole thing out loud, I said gently. But there's a note inside it in your own handwriting, Curtis. For scraps of love. Get her to sign voluntarily, first cleanest option. If not, file for capacity by November 9th. I closed the binder. You didn't tour a home for me. You scheduled my disappearance and gave it a deadline. Of begging for scraps of love. Then I lifted the last document from the box, the trust, the power of attorney, and I set it beside everything else. In case anyone here is still under the impression there's anything left to take, I said, begging for scraps of love. Every asset I own is now inside a trust the law will not allow any of you to touch. I finalized that 2 weeks ago while you were reserving my room. I folded my hands over the lid of the cedar box. Of begging for scraps of love. You cannot move someone, I said quietly. Who owns the room she's standing in? Then I did the one thing I had genuinely dreaded most. I reached for the small brass key at the bottom of the box, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I turned it in my fingers so the light caught the worn place along one edge. Renee, I said, look at this before you say another word. I held it up. Your father made this the week we bought that cottage, begging for scraps of love, so you and Simone would always have your own key to your own safe door, no matter what happened to the two of you out in the world. I never asked for it back once, not in 11 years of begging for scraps of love, because I never once wanted you to feel like a guest in the life I built for you. My voice did not rise. I had promised myself the whole drive home from the grocery store that it wouldn't. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You took the safety I gave you, and you let your husband try to turn the exact same kind of paperwork into the blueprint for locking your own mother away. That is the part of this month that actually broke my heart, of begging for scraps of love. Renee, not the word useless, that. I set the key down on the table beside the deed and the report and the closing statement, and the whole room finally went completely, thoroughly silent. Of begging for scraps of love. One orchestrated narrative conclusion spanning climax through resolution. Orchestrated narrative conclusion spanning climax through resolution. Renee broke, but not the way I think she'd hoped she would. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You're punishing me, she said, on her feet now, tears finally spilling over. You want to see me out on the street, your own daughter, after everything I've done for this family. I have a deed, a closing statement, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a doctor's signed report, and your own husband's handwriting, I said quietly. Bring all of it in front of a judge if you'd like, Renee. I'll happily meet you there. Curtis didn't yell. For scrap of love. Curtis did something colder instead. He gathered his folder, smoothed the front of his jacket, and said, flat as a closed door, we'll see what our attorney has to say about all of this. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and then he simply walked out of my living room without another word, without so much as a glance back at his own wife. Kane was already gone. I hadn't even seen him actually leave. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Marcus sat with his face in his hands for a long moment and would not look up at me. Not shame that fixed a single thing, I understood. Just shame sitting where a decision should have been. The cousins did not say, it's for the best anymore. The room had reached a new verdict. It simply hadn't said it out loud yet. I stood up slowly from my own sofa, on my own 2 feet in my own living room, for scraps of love. Here's the loving plan, I said, since everyone had come today expecting one. The room went completely still. I am staying in this house. That was never actually on the table. Of begging for scraps of love, no matter what anyone in this room decided to believe. The cottage closes Thursday. I will not be funding anyone's home equity line, and I will not be catching anyone who chose, on purpose, to jump. Renee made a small, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, wounded sound. Renee, I said, and I let my voice soften because underneath everything else she is still my daughter and I do still love her. I will love you until the day I die. Begging for scraps of love, but I am finished being the floor you stand on while you reach for my walls. You have until the 15th to find another place to live. I will help you carry boxes. For scraps of love, I will not help you avoid the actual lesson underneath all of this. Mom, please. My door is open, I said. My deed is mine. Both of those things are true at the exact same time. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and you're going to have to learn to live with both of them. I looked around at the cousins, at the church friend who had answered a group text about a woman none of them had bothered to actually call and ask. Of begging for scraps of love. There's still coffee if anyone wants it, I said. Otherwise, I believe this meeting is adjourned. They gathered their coats one by one, of begging for scraps of love. A few mumbled apologies on the way past me toward the door. The embarrassed kind, the kind that arrived too late to fix much of anything, but that still, in my experience, counts for something small. Of begging for scraps of love, Renee was last to leave, mascara ruined, standing for one moment in the exact spot in my doorway where a photograph I'd never shown her that afternoon had been taken years ago. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Though she had no idea she was standing there, that, more than anything else, told me I had made the right decision. I closed the door behind her, not slammed, just shut with a steady hand. Simone stayed. Marcus, of love, after a long silent moment, stayed too, sitting on the far end of the sofa with his hands still loosely clasped, saying nothing, which was, from him that day, its own kind of apology. Of begging for scraps of love. I want to tell you about the letter now because I haven't yet, and it belongs here, at the actual center of this story. More than almost anything else does, Walter left two things behind for me in that cedar box. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, not one. The first was a longer letter, meant for Simone, to be opened the year she turned 21, full of the kind of grandfatherly advice a man writes when he knows he won't be there to give it out loud. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, advice about work and about choosing carefully who gets to hold your keys. I have never opened that one. It isn't mine to read. The second was shorter, unsealed, written in the last months when he already knew 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I already knew exactly how little time we actually had left. He wrote it, he told me once, for whenever the door finally gets tested. I read it that Sunday afternoon out loud, to Simone and to Marcus. 10 years sitting in the same living room where everything had just come apart and started, very slowly, to come back together. Eleanor, it began, in his handwriting, which even at the end never once lost its steadiness, of begging for scraps of love. If you're reading this out loud to someone, it means somebody tried the door and found out it was locked the way I always told you to keep it. Of begging for scraps of love, I built that box with my own hands so nothing important in this family would ever depend on somebody else's memory or somebody else's good behavior. You always did the harder, quieter work of actually keeping us safe. Years of begging for scraps of love, and I never once said that out loud enough while I still could. Say it now, for both of us. And to whoever's sitting in that room listening to this, she is not useless. She never was. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She's the reason the rest of you had anything worth arguing over in the first place. I had to stop reading for a moment. Simone was openly crying by then. Marcus finally looked up, begging for scraps of love, and for the first time in a very long while, I watched my son actually let himself feel something in front of me instead of quietly managing it from a safe distance. Keep the door. I finished. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, my voice steady again by the last line. Keep it locked. That's what he told me, 3 separate times, near the end. I understand now that he didn't only mean the front door of this house. Begging for scraps of love, I think he meant every door I've ever had to decide, on my own, who actually deserved a key to. Here's how it landed, in the plain numbers I trust more than feelings, of begging for scraps of love, because feelings are important, but numbers are what actually hold up under a second look. Birch Hollow closed that Thursday, $430,000, clean, of begging for scraps of love to a young family whose little boy naps the very room Simone once learned to walk in. Curtis's home equity line remained entirely his and Renee's problem to solve, not mine, and without my cottage left to raid, begging for scraps of love. They solved it the ordinary way. They sold their own overextended house, paid down what they owed, and moved into a modest 2-bedroom rental, both their names on the lease this time, nobody else's. For scraps of love, the guardianship petition was never filed. Of begging for scraps of love, you do not bring a capacity case in front of a judge against a woman holding a sealed neuropsychological report and a chain of title with her name on it going back 11 clean years. Preston Kane, of begging for scraps of love, I later learned from a mutual acquaintance quietly stopped taking new transition clients in our county entirely sometime that winter. No commission, no case, of begging for scraps of love. No traffic cone blazer at anyone else's door that I ever heard of again. Marcus calls now, actually calls, most Sundays, not just when someone else needs him to weigh in on a decision. It's careful still, of begging for scraps of love. Some weeks more than others, but it's real, and I take real over smooth every single time now. Renee sent a long message about 6 weeks later. I only ever worried about you, Mom. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I can't believe you'd do something like this to your own family. No apology anywhere inside it, only a fresh version of the same invoice she'd been sending me my whole adult life. I read it once and did not write back. Of begging for scraps of love. Some letters I've learned don't deserve a reply. They only deserve a closed lid. Then, 4 months after that, on Simone's birthday, Renee showed up at my door unannounced, alone, no folder, no Curtis, and asked, of begging for scraps of love. Quietly, if she could see the trust documents, not to argue with them, she said, just to actually understand them for the first time instead of assuming. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. We sat at my kitchen table for 2 hours while I walked her through every page, the way I've walked 100 grieving families through 100 estates, and at the end of it she didn't apologize either, not fully. Years of begging for scraps of love, not the way I might have wanted. But she asked one honest question I hadn't heard from her in over a decade. What was it actually like, she asked, raising me alone after Dad died, of begging for scraps of love, when I was old enough to remember some of it, but not old enough to understand any of it. It wasn't an apology. It was better than one, of begging for scraps of love. In its own way, it was the first time in years she'd asked about my life instead of managing it. I told her the truth, all of it, and we sat there a long while after, not fixed, but no longer entirely broken either. Of begging for scraps of love, I let that be enough for now. Forgiveness and trust are two different keys, and I've learned the hard way that handing someone the wrong one too early doesn't protect anybody. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Curtis I have not spoken to since that Sunday afternoon, and I don't expect that to change. Some doors, once you've finally seen clearly what somebody was trying to do with a key to them, simply stay closed. Of begging for scraps of love, and that is a decision I have made peace with entirely. Simone graduates from her nursing program in the spring. She still comes by most Thursdays, and last month, without any prompting from me at all, of begging for scraps of love. She asked if she could learn to read a property deed properly, just so I always know exactly what I'm actually looking at. I taught her at this same kitchen table, of begging for scraps of love, the same way I once explained fine print to families twice her age. I think, of everyone in this story, she is the one who understood the real lesson soonest and most completely. That quiet love is of begging for scraps of love, given without ever once saying what it cost, is a gift only if the people receiving it choose to remember where it actually came from. The rest of us, it turns out, sometimes need the paperwork of begging for scraps of love. I took the Sienna Oaks brochure off the counter where it had sat face down for a month, and I finally threw it away, folded once inside the old closing statement for the cottage. Begging for scraps of love, the fantasy tucked inside the truth that had beaten it fair and square. Then I put the deed, the report, the trust, and the small brass key back into the cedar box where the safe things in this family have always lived, for scraps of love, and set it back on the shelf in my closet. The hinge creaked shut the way it has my entire life since Walter built it. The house is mine. It always was. For scraps of love. Useless was never the right word for the woman who paid off her own home at 59, who raised 2 children through a widowhood nobody warned her was coming, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and who spent 31 years teaching other families the difference between what a thing costs and what it's actually worth. It was, I've come to understand, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, simply the words somebody reached for when they needed me to stop asking questions long enough for them to take something that was never theirs to begin with. If you've ever sat in a room and heard your own family decide, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, out loud what you're no longer capable of, check whose name is actually on the paper before you believe a word of it. Do it this week while it's still just a precaution and not yet an emergency. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If this reminded you of a table you've sat at yourself, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Share this with someone who still needs to hear it before their own dinner table gets there first. For Scraps Love. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.